Thank you for joining us for the September edition of Planning Live. We hope everyone is keeping safe and well. This afternoon, I'm pleased to be joined by Beth Gray from SLR Consulting and Neil Collar, a partner and head of the planning team here. As I said, we are delighted to welcome Beth Gray to Planning Live this afternoon. Beth is an archaeologist and cultural heritage lead at SLR Consulting, based in Edinburgh but working throughout the UK and Ireland. Now, I'll hand over to Neil to kick off the discussion. Thanks.
Thanks, Victoria, and good afternoon, Beth. Thanks for joining us. Just starting, Victoria said there you're an archaeologist, and for me, and I suspect for a lot of people, you talk about archaeologist. Maybe people think of Indiana Jones, but we know that's the movies. But we think of time team, we think of people digging in trenches. You do work in environmental impact assessment, so obviously there's more to archaeology than the digging bit. So do you want to kind of chat us through what archaeologists do and what you do in particular?
Yeah, so I think, like you say, everyone sort of thinks archaeologist is like, time team. Everyone just gets down in a trench and starts digging. But there's so much more to it than that. Like we go from, it's metal detecting, it's environmental assessment in terms of, once you've finished your digging, what then do you find? You then go and look at all the environmental effects. So the pollen, the charcoal at the bottom, what information that gives us. It's sort of the material remains of human history. It's everything that we've sort of left behind, and that's the built environment as well as the actual buried remains. And it can also be things like the intangible associations with archaeology as well. So things like the border between Scotland and England, there's still a physical remain, that's an archaeological remain, but it's intangible setting as it is its historical context. So it's like it's both, but you would never protect both of, like you would never not develop Scotland and England, but that's still an association of archaeology in that historical context. And obviously archaeology is just one small element. It all falls under this banner of cultural heritage, and that's the historic environment, archaeology, built heritage, all of that. So there's a lot of strings to an archaeologist's bow, I guess.
And touching on what you do within the environmental impact assessment process, it doesn't feel at that stage that it involves a lot of digging. So what as an archaeologist do you bring to that bit of the process?
Yeah, so basically I look at everything that's cultural heritage, I guess. So when it comes to pre-application stage, application stage, what are the effects of development on the archaeology? And that's including things like setting, material remains. Are we going to directly impact things? Are we going to cause vibration effects, dewatering, that kind of thing? And we're talking a lot about environmental impact and onshore wind and stuff today, but that can be things like piling for housing developments and things like that as well. But yeah, so my job is basically to assist developers in the planning process and work their way around any sort of cultural heritage constraints that they might have, specifically in Scotland and Ireland, but I'm experienced throughout the UK.
Yeah, and just on that geographic issue, is there much of a difference between different parts of the UK, Ireland, in terms of archaeology and what, as an archaeologist, you do?
Yeah, so like the digging's exactly the same. Every archaeologist knows how to, dig a ditch, for example, and record it, and that's relatively the same across the UK and Ireland. But the way in which the planning systems work is very different for heritage. So you'll notice in Scotland, we don't ever refer to things as harm like we would in England under MPPF. Wales, they do their ISODAL assessments for onshore wind, which is very similar to our EIA sort of process in terms of like your major, moderate impacts, but it's more quantifiable. And then Ireland's system is wildly different, but it all sort of leads back. And heritage-wise, we're a bit lucky because It all feeds back through Historic Environment Scotland's guidance within the EIA handbook. So it's a bit easier in that sense. But the planning systems make how we deal with archaeology and cultural heritage very different. And all of that falls under the same banner, which was the Borough Charter that ICOMOS sets out across the EU. But because of the specific legislation that sits behind it and the policies in each individual region, it makes it very specific to that area.
Yeah, which is always really interesting because we so often find within the planning system things seem very similar. So it's easy to fall into the trap of assuming, well, it must be the same. So interesting to hear for archaeology, as in others, similar doesn't necessarily mean the same. So you've got to be a bit careful. Just sort of looking at what within the assessment process you would be looking at, what the planning system's looking at. You mentioned there in the context of built development housing, I think it was in particular, and the example of piling. And so that's potential physical damage to the cultural heritage asset, the archaeological remains or whatever. It's easy for us all to grasp that concept of physical damage, but setting of a scheduled ancient monument, for instance, is taken into account. Why is it that we take into account impact on setting rather than just physical damage?
So it's basically because when we think about scheduled monuments and listed buildings, GDLs, we have the physical remains of them, which we protect under legislation. However, that's only one small part of their cultural significance. So that's just one thing that makes up why that thing is important. So setting is another thing that we add into it. If you stood at the top of Arthur's Seat, which is a scheduled monument, you would want to protect those views outwards because that was part of its setting. And it's not to be confused with visual amenity, even though it falls very similar and often goes hand in hand in a lot of spaces. Setting is things that make that asset more important, or it helps us understand it or appreciate it or experience it. And all of that links back into policy set out by HES. And it is a funny one. It's something that not every asset has. It's some of them do, some of them don't. Some of them are more sensitive to change than others. I was reading the other day about a scheduled monument that sits in a suburb in Edinburgh, and it's been like that since the 70s. So therefore its setting has largely changed from what it originally was, which was a Neolithic standing stone. But that's now its setting, whilst it's not its original setting, it's now important because it's been incorporated into that development. So it's how modern appreciation has changed that. So it is complicated and it can turn into a can of worms, and ultimately we have to do it and we have to take it into account because that's what MPF and HEPs dictate of us. But we want to preserve those settings for current and future generations, and that's why we have to take them into account when it comes to EIA. And also as well, everything has its threshold for change, and it's balancing that change between, are we doing a significant detrimental impact for the sake of net zero, for example, or are we okay? Is it going to be acceptable to change? And that's what EIA effectively is, and it's finding that nice balance between the two. And it's not always easy, and it's hard, especially when you're not, in my world every day of looking at all these scheduled monuments. It's hard to perceive why that's important. It's hard to perceive why standing on top of a hill at Hill Fort and looking out and going, well, I can still see the view and I can still appreciate it, but having that wind farm there might be a significant impact. So that's just one example, and everything gets assessed on its own merit. So it's hard, you can't use one development's findings for your example and things like that. So it's just finding that nice balance between the two.
And from what you're saying, it sounds as though inevitably there's quite a large degree of professional judgment. So what sort of factors would you typically be tending to take into account? I hear what you say, that it's obviously circumstance specific, but what sort of things would be relevant in reaching that judgment?
So we go through a process. So we look at the specific of the asset. So what is it? You know, I use hill forts because they're relatively straightforward in their setting 9 times out of 10. You know, if we take a hill fort, for example, right, well, we know it's going to sit at the top of a hill 9 times out of 10. How far does it look? What's its focus is on? And then we run things like bare earth ZTVs to establish, you know, what is the worst case scenario? What is the worst case visibility that this asset might have of the development? Is it all of it? Is it none of it? You know, how far away is it as well? You know, what is that asset's focus on? You know, has it been altered in the past? That's another thing that we take into account. You know, has it been, you know, has its setting been changed? How, you know, are there other assets in the vicinity that it relates to as well? You know, in which case are the views to and from those assets? Is there going to be a development in there? So there's a lot of factors that we do to get to the stage of, is it going to be impactful? Is it a showstopper is another question. And if so, you know, on what scale do we think it's going to fall? Is it going to fall on, we're going to have to assess it, but we don't think it's going to be a significant impact? Or is it going to be, it's not significant, it's a significant impact, but then also, is there no visibility, in which case there might be no impact at all? We'll also look at proximity, because, you know, the closer you are, often the more impactful things are, in a lot of cases. So we'll look at proximity, and then see where these things lie and what their setting might be, and then we start the process all over again. Yeah, and then other times we'll look at noise as well, which is often something people don't often think about when it comes to cultural heritage, is why you're looking for noise impact, but noise can sometimes just be as impactful as turning blades, for example. And that's what we look at more when it comes to proximity and things. And then we try and cap it, because we don't want to be assessing everything out to 45 kilometres. Not because that isn't always important, but also not everything's settings 45 kilometres of views. So we try and cap it, and we'll normally come to an agreement with HES and stuff about specifics when it comes to things like that. But those are the main things that we look for when it comes to setting out, I guess, our scope of assessment for these things, and especially when looking at setting, because those are 9 times out of 10 now what it is we're looking for.
You mentioned there showstoppers, and it's the thing that's always intriguing, because objectors to developments quite often will say every EIA always supports the development, the developer pays the consultants. It's not any surprise that they're supporting, you know, the EIA as a positive. Have you had situations where a developer's come to you and you've done some assessment work and you've gone back to them and said, from archaeology, it's a no?
Yeah, many. It's quite common now. Obviously, you know, we've gotten to a stage now with onshore wind where, from a constraints perspective, there's no easy site no easy sites left. You know, it's either landscape, or it's peat, or it's ornithology, or it's cultural heritage. You know, I was looking at some statistics today, and there's over 8,500 scheduled monuments in Scotland. We're effectively running out of room, and I don't mean that in a detrimental way, but because everything has its threshold for change, like I was saying. But yeah, quite a lot of sites we get now, either I've said it, where I've said, oh, this wouldn't meet what I think is the policy test, and then in other cases it's been, well, it won't meet the policy test just now, but we can design it potentially in a way that makes it meet the policy test. And then you have some sites that it's just not possible. And also as well, we forget that the heights of turbines are going up, and that's just led by the industry. You know, when I first started doing this 7 years ago, which doesn't seem like that long, probably to many people, but you know, turbines were 120, 150 meters tall, and now we're looking at 250s, 275s. You know, that's 100 meters taller, and people, you don't actually realize how tall that is until you go out and you look at some of these operational wind farms, and you go, "Oh God, that's a really tall turbine," and then you go, "Actually, that's actually only 120 meters tall. What I'm putting into development now is nearly double that." And suddenly the scale of these things is like, oh, actually, this is quite big. You know, so.
And again, picking up on the type of things that objectors mention, and I'm not going to go into Big Bens and things, coming at it from a different angle. They quite often focus on it's called a wind farm, but that's a misnomer. It's not like an agricultural, it's actually an industrial development. And that's where I wanted to sort of come back to you and just chat about the wind farms in particular. As you say, getting taller and taller turbines, that industrial type focus, if you like, and maybe just talk us through in a bit more detail how you assess the impact of turbines on the setting of scheduled monuments.
Yeah, so obviously we go back through that process of like, you know, what is the sensitivity of change kind of thing, and then we go through, you know, the contributing factors to significance as well as setting, because not everything has a setting. We'll often set a study area to look at that, and then we'll basically go through the EIA process. So we'll scope it with HES and the council, and then we'll, once that's sort of been agreed, we'll then look at design elements and say, right, what do we need to change? Do we need to change anything? That's through wirelines, photo montages. We sometimes use a 3D model that our engineering team use to help sort of design infrastructure, but it can help if like we haven't been to site yet for whatever reason. And then we'll go through the EIA and say, right, okay, you know, we have our asset. How important is it if it's, you know, a scheduled monument, category A, B, C, that kind of thing. And then we'll say, right, what are the positive and negative contributing factors of setting? And the positive things are the things I've sort of said before, but then we also look at like baseline considerations. You know, do you have a quarry right next to your scheduled monument that's operational, you know, and it's going to be there for the next however long with a giant scar on the landscape? Is there conifer plantations that are already there? You know, we forget that conifer plantations, and I think this is quite a miscommunication to the public sometimes, is that conifer plantations, whilst is great, you know, build more trees, that kind of thing. I'm not an ecologist, so I'm not going to go into the different effects of different trees. But also things like, you know, conifer plantations are really impactful on archaeology, especially buried archaeology, because of the depths of the ditches that they have to do for the plantation. So people will sit there and say, oh, you know, this asset goes through this conifer plantation and it goes through your site, and it's like, but it's gone. Like, I know that's gone. There's no point in me even going to try and look at it, much less like, you know, have a tree smack me in the face. But like, but it's so detrimental. So we'll look at stuff like that as well. You know, if we have a felling plantation schedule, we'll look at that too. Is there other wind farms in the area that are operational that we consider that a baseline effect? And then we'll look at what the impact might be on the setting. And it's not just a visual thing. You know, are you distracted? Are they behind you when you stand at the asset looking out over the key aspects of setting? So if you think about our hill fort again, you know, you're looking out over a nice valley, but the proposed development's behind you. well, how far away is it from you? Are you actually going to hear it? No, or is it going to affect your perception of the setting and the relationship between the fort and the valley? No. Okay, that's fine. And then we look at that in terms of the EIA scale. Is it major, moderate, minor? Is it negligible? That kind of thing. And then at the end, we kind of weight that against MPF4 and if it's compliant or not under policy 7H, point 2 if we're being specific. And then we also look at the cumulative effects and seeing how that falls in terms of sort of our cumulative wires and things.
And you mentioned there about MPF4, bringing it back into the planning context, because this is planning live, so we've got to have some planning in it. Archaeology, cultural heritage more generally, it's been a planning issue for many years. I actually went and reminded myself because I thought, hang on a minute, MPPG 5, for those of us who are experienced, was issued in 1994, so 30 years ago. I can't honestly remember if that was sort of the first time archaeology got a big mention in planning policy, but it was certainly a bit of a landmark. In modern times, I've heard people talk about developer-led archaeology. So how important is archaeology cultural heritage within the planning process now? I don't want to go back to 1994. Let's just do now.
I was going to say, I wasn't born then, so let's not. It's really important. Like, I think we've seen now with MPF4 and SPP, just the important weight that should be given to heritage. We've seen that with Sheardrum, with Lethen, Fosside to an extent. SPR is one recently that I can't for the life of me remember the name of. That's all been quite heavily influenced by cultural heritage, and it's hard to get your head around sometimes that these things have been here for sometimes 5,000 years, and we want to protect that. It's not like ecology where we can try and restore it and bring it back. Once it's gone, that's it. It's gone. Like, we're not going to have a second chance at this. And things like onshore wind, they often have a shelf life. It's usually 35 years, but we're now seeing things like in perpetuity come through in the planning system. So we need to watch what we're doing, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't obviously progress to net zero. But we just need to find a nice balance between the two. MPF4 coming in, obviously there's been a lot of disciplines where I'd say the rules have almost softened. We've seen developments in wildland now, which obviously wouldn't have happened before for landscape. So it's almost things like landscapes, I don't want to say came down in levels of importance, but I'd say it's become more acceptable, whereas heritage has stayed exactly the same as it was under SPP. So it's almost leveled the playing field in terms of what things are getting more focused and what light's getting shed on them within the planning system. So we just have to find that nice balance between the two. Obviously, we have this goal by the Scottish Government and we want to make that goal, but we also can't be detrimental to, not just heritage, but, landscape, ecology, ornithology, peatland restoration, those kind of things as well.
And this label of developer-led archaeology, in part, the work you do through EIA is part of that. We also see within consents quite often conditions requiring further archaeological investigation. So how is that fairly common to see that sort of condition on a planning permission that means a developer is going to have to pay to get, well, would that typically be a bit of digging?
Yeah, so it can be. Obviously in Scotland, we deal with a lot of upland landscapes. So more times out of 10, it's either what we call sort of targeted trial trenching or targeted strip map and sample, where we just go in and look at these very specific things. Or it'll be, we'll have a watching brief on X amount of track, for example. But then in sort of more rural landscapes where the ground's a bit nicer, everything's a bit more easily preserved, you're not trying to dig through, 2 meters of peat, we will have trial trenching. And one of the things, especially in Scotland versus England, and I used to work in England, we used to look at things like a 2% trial trench. That's nothing in Scotland. In Scotland, we look at 8 to 12% of a site. So these kind of conditions, they can be not just, costly in terms of financial cost, but timely as well. It takes a long time to dig 12% of, 1,000 hectares. And that's a lot of digging to ask of any sort of contractor. So that's things like we want to try and front load these things as much as possible. So you'll see things like predetermination, trial trenching in England, or they do geophysics, which we're not very good at in doing in Scotland. We try and do more of it in sort of our more rural locations. There's sort of this, it's not a myth, but it's sort of this falsehood that we can't do geophysics in Scotland because the soil's rich in iron. We do it on a number of our sites, and it does work, and it works very well. And obviously some sites, it works better than others, but that's no different to doing it in, say, Lincoln and Nottingham. You could have same sort of problems. But one of the risks that, we always try and say is, to alleviate those risks is to try and front load it as much as possible. Get your early stage feasibilities done, get an archaeologist in to look at the site, and we'll be able to combat that risk as soon as possible. We've recently compiled a feasibility study where we found an unrecorded plane crash. That's not what you expect to have to tell your client. And it wouldn't have stopped the development, but we suddenly had to be incredibly careful of, right, well, can we put a turbine in this location and can we not? So yeah, it's just good to advise developers, no matter where you are, is to get a feasibility done, and not just that, here's what's on your site feasibility, but how does that actually impact your development? What are your risks? We do our reports and we'll say, oh, you've got 20 scheduled monuments in 2 kilometers of the site. That means nothing to anyone. That's a statistic. Whereas if you say you've got 20 kilometers inside 2 kilometers of your site, and 3 of those look at each other, and you're going to stick your turbines right smack bang in the middle, that's not going to comply with any historic environment policy. So you've suddenly got a key risk to your project, and that's what you've got to take forward, rather than us get to a point of design or gate check and say, oh yeah, this is a really big risk, and your client spent quite a lot of money on getting their development to this point. Whereas if we'd front loaded it, we can say those things early and get them communicated the best we can. So I'd say that's one of the biggest things that we have to be looking at, especially in sort of and it is just risk, it's consenting risk. And that's what, as a consultant, we're here to manage for our developers.
Yeah, and it picks up the classic known knowns, known unknowns, etc., etc. And it was interesting, at the risk of making it sound like we're so finger on the pulse with organising this, but we are. There was story in the media, I think it was last week, about a solar project in England where, and this is obviously a bit of an extreme, they discovered, I think it's a Roman town, which hadn't been known about and has now become a scheduled monument. And all of this is, from what I picked up, pre-consenting, pre-development. So I don't know to what extent it's a disaster for the developer, but it does show how you can have a situation where you're going into the unknown, and as you're saying, it's better to go in with open eyes and find out as much as you can, rather than spend lots of money, get far down the process, only to have that awful moment where you discover possibly a big chunk of your site just isn't developable.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of the time we get brought on board when we're not at site selection stage. The site's been selected, year one of bird surveys has gone down the line, or ecology surveys have happened, all that kind of thing. And then we come in and say, well, we should do geophysics. And, to a lot of developers, that's like an unprecedented cost, because they're like, well, why? It's like, well, because we can see these things on aerial photography, or the HER's telling us. And that's things that often the developers don't see. And that's why we always say, we want to tell you the risks, because we don't want to get down the line and not have a consent, because it sounds really bad, but it's a waste of time. It's a waste of money. We want to get things consented, we want to get things moving. So that's why we want to do these things early, and just get those sort of open eyes, as you say, and see what we're dealing with. And archaeology can stop a project, whether that's buried archaeology or setting effects. And I think MPF4 is kind of showing that a little bit. But then there's other things that we can do. We can look at the benefit as well as the negatives, and sort of not everything's doom and gloom when it comes to archaeology. We can do better things. We can make things, we can make benefits for the public as well, which, I think is becoming more common now than it used to be.
Yeah, and just in that risk to the development sort of issue, exploring that a bit further, quite often see in the media stories about, oh, we've found a such and such, interesting archaeological remains. I get the impression quite often that doesn't stop the housing development or whatever it was that was funding the investigation. So archaeological remains, even post-consent, isn't necessarily a problem.
No, it's not. So we do things through what we call it is preservation in the record. So obviously, the first and foremost, we want to preserve these things in situ. So as we find them, if we can, So we had it recently with a development where we found medieval farmsteads that were buried, and rather than have half of the park cover it, we redesigned it so the park would be on top of it. So therefore, we're preserving it in situ beneath the park. We've recorded it through geophysics, but we don't need to do any sort of intrusive survey in terms of trial trenching or excavation, and then the housing developments around it. So we've preserved that. And then after that, we do what's called preservation, but through record, which is when you're looking at things like your excavations, your trial trenching, that kind of thing. And it might cause a delay, and it might cause, more work than maybe what we were expecting, but it doesn't always preclude development. And we don't want it to. And a lot of planning officers will sit there and say they don't want it to. It's sort of like really, really special things like that Roman town that sort of preclude development. So it's not ever something to sort of be worried about. Like, archaeologists can be quite dramatic. We are a bit of a dramatic bunch, but we're not. It's not that bad. I think Joe Watton at Onshore Wind recently called us spicy, which was quite good.
I heard that.
So we're also quite dramatic bunch. So yeah, it's never as doom and gloom as we might be making it out. And if we are really pushing the point, then yeah, okay, it might be a bit doom and gloom.
And a couple of minutes ago, you mentioned benefits, and I think it's one of the interesting things in terms of talking to people about EIA, that EIA is about assessing effects. It's not well, impacts, it is impacts, but there always tends to be a focus on the negatives, the adverse effects, but EIA is obviously taking into account everything. So when you were talking about benefits, what are the potential benefits of development in a situation where there is cultural heritage value?
Yeah, so, and it's something that, like, as an industry, I think archaeologists sometimes have to hold their hand up and say we're quite bad at doing. We often forget that it's not just about the digging. We can do other things. We can do outreach at schools, we can do community excavations, through development. It doesn't have to be just, one archaeologist watching a machine. We can do sort of targeted community excavations and get locals involved. We can add benefit by informing, local people of all this amazing history that's on their doorstep. A lot of people remember things like, the pillboxes and the things that they can see, but they forget that they've got, these really nice hill forts that they can go and walk up at the weekends, or they can, look at these standing stones. And, I think I was looking at it the other day, and like I was saying, 8,500 scheduled monuments, and even if half of those have signage boards, there's another half that people don't even know about, and a lot of the time some of them are buried and some of them aren't. But if you can even just see lumps and bumps in the ground and you've got a signage board to say this is what's here, people will stop and look at it and go, oh yeah, that's really interesting, and that's what this is about. One of the things in the strategy for Scotland's archaeology is that we want to enhance these things for future generations as well as current generations. And part of that is adding these benefits. And if we can do that through developer-led archaeology, then we should be doing that. We've been working with bigger economics on a number of projects and looking at how we can enhance these monuments for people that are around them. We talk a lot about, information boards and like walking paths and stuff, but then it's also looking at things like, how do we do this? Like, how do we get people who can't access these monuments, involved? Well, we can do things like photogrammetry, so like 3D modeling of these monuments, and put them up on, a free website that people can go and look at. Hess recently done that with a bunch of their recumbent stone circles in Aberdeenshire throughout COVID. But that's because people couldn't go out and visit them. But then why are we stopping at COVID? We could do this all the time. And it doesn't, it's not a big cost for developers to do this. It's, just another thing that you'd be doing, as well as, I don't know, going out and giving a talk in school about peat restoration or about the wind farm. Well, why stop at just the wind farm? Let's go and talk to them about this history that's on their doorstep, or about the ecology that we found on this site. And then another thing is that we look at is things like, not to get a bit political, but Brexit has caused a lot of depletion in the archaeology community because of the threshold for pay. So it's no surprise archaeologists are paid pretty poorly. And because of that, it means that we have a shortage of archaeologists in the country, because we used to have a lot of European nationals come over to work in the UK because it's harder to get jobs as archaeologists on mainland Europe. And now there's a shortage. And it's so, by doing these benefits, by doing these community excavations, talks at local schools, we can funnel people into the sector and make it a better place for everyone to go and work, and to educate more people and just get more people involved. Because, I didn't have this because, I'm not there yet. But a lot of my more senior colleagues, they still often get referred to as, this is just a hobby for you. But it's not, as much as this, yes, it's our passion. We want to get it better. We want it to be a proper, good profession that people can come into and they want to enjoy and working in it, and they want to stay in it as well. And that's one of the benefits that I think not just EIA, but, just developer-led engagement and community benefit can do. Obviously, EIA it's a bit easier because we have community benefit funds that we, put through. But yeah, we're looking at a lot of options on a lot of different sites, and luckily Simon at Biggers, who's we've been working with most with it, but it's not just limited to SLR and bigger economics. Like it's for everyone, and I think everyone should be doing it. And it's worth noting as well that Hess will always, I don't want to put words in Hess' mouth actually, but enhancement is always encouraged by local authorities because it's something that it costs a lot of money, and as a charity they don't get as much to look after these monuments that I think my personal view is that we should be looking after.
And when you're talking there about the sort of community outreach sort of thing, just to let people in Edinburgh know, and I'm sure it's not Edinburgh specific, but I've seen in the last few months quite a lot of things on social media about basically open days on sites in Edinburgh that are being developed, and this is just the archaeological investigation. I feel slightly guilty because I've meant several times to go along and not actually quite made it, but that openness is appreciated, that the opportunity is there for people to go along and sort of see, oh, well, what have you found? What's the interest? Edinburgh obviously has a lot of historical evolution, so there's lots of different areas depending on where the site is, what they might be finding. So it is definitely a positive there. Now, Victoria, I suspect you're about to tell us about time.
I am. I'm sorry because everybody's passion
okay.
and enthusiasm has been shining through for the past 43 minutes, but I'm mindful of time. So I don't know if if there's any last points you want to make, Beth, and then we can round off. I'm conscious you've covered a lot of ground in the time we've had this afternoon.
No, I don't think so. I just, thank you for inviting me to come and talk about it. And, I am passionate about archaeology, and I'm passionate about, EIA and, renewables. So it's a good topic to cover, really.
Absolutely, and I think more than anything, it shines through that you're passionate about working with developers so that there's the enhancement of cultural heritage assets. They're made more accessible for people as development proceeds. So I think that's such a positive message for all of us working in the profession, that it's about finding the best solution all round as opposed to just saying no. So no, thank you very much. And I'm sure everybody like me has learned a lot this afternoon, that it goes a lot more than just digging the trench. Thank you very much, Beth. Just on that note, our next Planning Live session will be back on the 31st of October. Not so much a Halloween special, but we'll be discussing the matter of flooding with our guest Michael Stewart from SLR Consulting. So we hope to see you then. Thanks again for joining us today, and for Beth and Neil for leading us in this discussion. I hope everyone has a good evening. Thanks. Bye-bye.